settle in for a while, and let the edges of the day soften. Tonight, we are visiting one of the most enduring creatures in Greek mythology, the Minotaur, that quiet figure from the old stories of Crete, half human and half bull, placed at the center of a legend that has lasted for centuries. If you enjoy these calm journeys through myth and the ancient world, you are welcome to like the video, subscribe, or leave a gentle comment, perhaps with where you are listening from tonight, or what myth you would like to hear next. For now, there is nothing to solve and nothing to rush. Just a slow story, told softly with enough room for the mind to wander and the body to rest. So let us move carefully into the old Cretan tale, and begin with the Minotaur as people first imagined it, long before the hero arrived at the center of the maze. The Minotaur belongs to the body of Greek myth, but it also carries the atmosphere of much older Mediterranean imagination. It is not a creature that appears in everyday life, of course, yet the Greeks built it from familiar shapes: the human form, the bull's strength, and the maze-like uncertainty of a place that cannot easily be escaped. That mixture made the Minotaur memorable. It was strange enough to feel sacred, and familiar enough to feel possible inside a dream. Its name is often understood as a simple description, meaning something like the Bull of Minos. That connection matters because the story is tied to King Minos of Crete, whose rule and household are central to the myth. In Greek storytelling, names often anchor monsters to places and families, as if the creature itself grows from the land and the dynasty around it. The Minotaur is therefore not only a beast in a labyrinth, it is also a sign of royal trouble, a living consequence of a divine bargain gone wrong. The tale is usually associated with Crete, the great island in the southern Aegean. To the ancient Greek imagination, Crete was distant but important, a place of old power and old memory. Its palaces, trade routes, and myths gave it a special role in stories of kings, gods, and human mistakes. When later writers placed the Minotaur there, they were drawing on an island already rich with legend. The creature became part of Crete's mythic identity, as if the island itself held a hidden chamber where ancient fear could be kept. One reason the Minotaur endures is that it sits at a crossroads of meanings. It is a monster, but it is also a prisoner. It is dangerous, but also trapped. It is born from a family story, yet it is treated as if it were a problem that must be hidden away. That combination gives the myth a quiet sadness. The Minotaur is not simply an enemy to be defeated. It is also a reminder that myths often preserve the memory of disorder inside a royal house, where power, pride, and divine forces meet. The earliest Greek audiences would likely have heard the Minotaur story as part of a larger cycle of tales about Athens, Crete, and heroic testing. It belongs to a world where monsters are not random creations. They are connected to lineage, ritual, and social order. In that sense, the Minotaur is less like a fantasy animal and more like a symbol made flesh, a figure through which the Greeks could think about hidden shame, difficult obligations, and the heavy cost of crossing boundaries. The creature's famous shape probably helped the story travel. A bull-headed being is easy to picture, even in dim light, because bulls were already powerful animals in the ancient world. They represented vitality, force, and danger, but also sacrifice and ceremony. The human face added intelligence and sorrow. Together, those features made the Minotaur look like a being suspended between instinct and reason, which may be one reason the story still feels so unsettling in a quiet, lasting way. As the myth developed, writers and artists often emphasized the labyrinth more than the creature itself, yet the Minotaur remains the reason the labyrinth matters. Without the beast, the maze is just architecture in imagination. With the beast, it becomes a place of confinement, ritual fear, and hidden life. The two ideas belong together so closely that many later retellings use the Minotaur as shorthand for the entire mystery of Crete. The story also shows how myth can preserve emotional truth even when the details are fantastic. A royal family may not literally have kept a monster beneath a palace, but stories like this can hold memories of tension, power, and sacrifice. the Minotaur becomes a vessel for those old pressures, allowing later listeners to feel the weight of a tale that is both impossible and strangely human. In that way, the Minotaur is more than a creature from one episode of mythology. It is a shape that gathers many older ideas into one quiet image: the bull, the king, the maze, the hidden chamber, and the uneasy feeling that something inside the beautiful palace has gone deeply wrong. The Minotaur is inseparable from the Cretan king Minos, whose name appears in nearly every telling of the myth. Minos is not just a background ruler. He is the human center around which the whole legend turns. Ancient storytellers often linked monsters to kings because royal houses were imagined as places where divine favor, pride, and punishment could all be felt at once. In the Minotaur story, the king's authority does not prevent disorder. Instead, it helps create it. Minos is usually presented as the one who asked Poseidon for a sign and then failed to honor the god's expectation. That failure matters because Greek myths often move from promise to breach, and from breach to consequence. The Minotaur enters the world as the result of a sacred imbalance. The story does not treat the creature as a random nightmare, it treats it as the long shadow of broken trust. This is one reason the myth feels so structured. Every major element has a cause. A king asks for help. A god grants a magnificent bull. The king keeps what should have been offered back. The queen becomes entangled in the divine punishment. The child born from that confusion is hidden away. Each step leads naturally to the next, like an old moral lesson wrapped in a house of shadows. The Minotaur's existence also places the myth in a deeply Greek framework of consequence. In many stories, humans cannot simply take what the gods provide and use it however they wish. Sacred gifts carry obligations. When those obligations are ignored, the result may be calamity that lasts for generations. The Minotaur is therefore not just a beastly child. It is a monument to imbalance. The word monster can make the creature seem purely frightening, but the ancient world often saw monsters as boundary beings. They mark where categories blur. The Minotaur has both man and bull in it, both human lineage and animal force. That mix would have felt meaningful to a culture attentive to shape, symbol, and ritual difference. The creature is not merely ugly. It is unstable in a way that mirrors the instability of the story around it. Minos himself became a figure of judgment in later tradition. In some accounts, he ruled justly enough to be remembered as a lawgiver, while in others he was stern, proud, and dangerously absolute. The Minotaur myth contributes to that complexity. A great king who cannot control the consequences of his own household is still a king, but not an untroubled one. The beast in the labyrinth quietly undermines the image of perfect rule. This connection between ruler and creature also helps explain why the story remained useful to poets and dramatists. It is not only about a monster in a maze. It is about the hidden cost of authority, the way a palace can contain both grandeur and disaster. The Minotaur, then, belongs as much to the history of kingship in myth as it does to the history of monsters. And because Minos's name is woven so tightly into the tale, the creature is never just a solitary beast. It is always the Minotaur of Minos, a being that carries the flavor of family trouble, political order, and divine accounting all at once. One of the quietest and most unsettling features of the myth is the Minotaur's birth. In many versions, it is not born in the ordinary way at all, but from a union that belongs to the realm of divine punishment and impossible desire. The queen Pasiphae is drawn into the story through the will of the gods, and the result is a child unlike any other in Greek mythology. Ancient listeners would have understood this as a tale where the boundary between human life and cosmic correction becomes difficult to see. Pasiphae's role makes the myth deeply personal. The Minotaur is not simply a beast delivered from the outside. It comes from the royal household itself. That detail turns the story inward, toward the hidden chambers of family and court. Many myths use monsters to represent external threats, but here the monster emerges from within. The danger is intimate, and that intimacy gives the tale a lasting sadness. The birth is usually tied to Poseidon's sacred bull, a magnificent animal sent as a sign of support or recognition. When Minos does not sacrifice it as promised, the story shifts into an area where divine order and human appetite collide. The punishment is not direct in the simple sense of a lightning strike. It is creative, strange, and terrible. Greek mythology often imagines divine correction in forms that are symbolic rather than merely destructive. Later retellings sometimes try to explain the mechanics of this birth more clearly, but the core image remains the same: a mother, a king, a god, and a child whose existence is itself a form of consequence. The Minotaur is born not from nature alone, but from a broken arrangement between beings at different levels of power. That makes it one of mythology's most striking examples of a life created under pressure. The story also reflects ancient anxieties about lineage. In royal families, bloodline mattered enormously. A child who was both inside the family and yet outside normal human form could symbolize a dynasty under strain. The Minotaur, hidden because of its nature, becomes a secret that the House of Minos cannot carry openly. In mythic terms, secrets rarely remain small. They grow into structures, prisons, and rituals. Pasiphae herself is often treated with a mix of pity and distance in later readings. She is not a simple villain. She is a figure caught in a divine design. That makes the Minotaur's birth less like an origin story for a monster and more like an illustration of how myth understands suffering. The innocent may be drawn into consequences that begin long before them. The result is a creature that feels emotionally charged from the very beginning. The Minotaur is born into shame, into secrecy, and into a household already burdened by the gods. It does not enter the world with a clear place in it. Instead, the world must build a hidden place for it, and that hidden place becomes the labyrinth. So from the earliest point in the tale, the Minotaur is not just a being. It is a problem shaped like a being, a living reminder that in Greek myth, the consequences of broken sacred promises can become physical and enduring. Poseidon's sacred bull is one of the most important pieces in the story, even though it is sometimes mentioned only briefly. The bull was not chosen by accident. In the ancient Mediterranean, bulls were powerful symbols, associated with strength, fertility, sacrifice, and royal display. A bull sent by a god would have carried enormous meaning. It was not merely an animal, but a sign that the divine world had entered human affairs in a visible form. The myth suggests that Minos received the bull and then failed to sacrifice it as promised. That breach matters because sacrifice in Greek religion was not a casual gesture. It was a formal act of exchange, a way of maintaining balance between mortals and gods. To keep the bull for oneself, especially after promising it back to Poseidon, was to break the pattern of reciprocity on which much of mythic order depends. The bull's beauty or magnificence is often emphasized in later versions because that helps explain why Minos hesitated. It is easier for a story to unfold when the temptation is understandable. A splendid animal, rare and powerful, can seem too fine to surrender, but in the logic of myth, that very hesitation produces the disorder that follows. The bull is therefore both a gift and a test. Bull imagery also fits Crete especially well. Archaeology and ancient art show that bulls mattered deeply in Minoan culture, long before the later Greek retellings fully took shape. That background may have helped the myth feel rooted in the island. Whether the tale preserves memory of ritual bull use or simply reflects the wider prominence of the animal, the connection is hard to ignore. The Minotaur and the sacred bull belong to the same imaginative field. The creature that results from the story carries the bull's energy into a human-like body. That union creates a being that is not simply monstrous but symbolically dense. The bull suggests sacrifice and power. The human form suggests thought and suffering. The two together produce a figure suited to an old myth about divine repayment gone awry. It is also worth noticing how carefully Greek myth uses animals to express moral and emotional realities. A bull is strong, but also difficult to control. It can stand for masculine force, for fertility, and for sacred danger. In the Minotaur story, that symbolism is intensified because the animal shape is no longer separate from the human world. It becomes the human world's consequence. The sacred bull also helps the myth move from the open air into the hidden interior of the palace. What was once a bright sign from the sea becomes the source of a concealed problem. That transition from public wonder to private shame is one of the story's quiet powers. The bull is seen, desired, withheld, and then transformed into a family burden. In that sense, the sacred bull is the beginning of the Minotaur's entire atmosphere. It brings divinity into the tale, but also the possibility of error. And once that error is made, the myth does what myths often do best. It gives the error a body, a place, and a name. In the oldest Greek stories, the Minotaur is not simply a monster waiting in a maze, but the uneasy result of a royal family story gone wrong. His beginning is tied to the island of Crete, to a powerful king named Minos, and to a divine punishment that arrives in the form of desire, pride, and embarrassment. The tale usually says that Minos should have honored the god Poseidon with a fine bull, but when the bull appeared beautiful and extraordinary, he kept it for himself. In response, the gods did not send thunder or fire, but something far stranger and more unsettling. Minos's wife, Pasiphae, was made to fall into a doomed fascination with the bull. The result, in the logic of myth, was the Minotaur, a being born between categories, neither fully human nor fully animal, and therefore especially frightening to the Greek imagination. This origin story is important because it reminds us that monsters in ancient myth often begin as signs of disorder. They are not random beasts. They are visible proof that something sacred has been disturbed, and that the world has answered in a way no one can easily undo. Pasiphae's role in the story has fascinated later readers for centuries because it gives the myth an almost dreamlike quality. Ancient authors do not always agree on the details, and some versions feel more symbolic than literal, but the atmosphere remains the same. There is an impossible attraction, a crossing of boundaries, and a birth that should not have happened. In older art and poetry, this kind of tale was not necessarily meant to be read as a straightforward event. It can also be understood as a moral image, the sort of story that explains what happens when humans resist limits set by the gods. The Minotaur, in that sense, is not only a creature of flesh and appetite, he is a living consequence. His existence turns the royal palace of Crete into a place of secrecy and shame, where beauty and power cannot prevent the spread of danger. Even before he is placed in the labyrinth, the monster has already altered the emotional shape of the entire myth, making it feel hushed, tragic, and strangely enclosed, as if the story itself were moving through narrow stone corridors. That famous labyrinth, the twisting prison associated with the Minotaur, may be one of the most enduring images in all of myth. Yet scholars have long wondered whether the ancient Greeks imagined it as a single impossible maze, or as a more ordinary but confusing structure that later storytelling transformed into something legendary. The word itself suggests a place made of complex pathways, a design meant to trap and disorient. Some have connected the labyrinth with real palatial architecture on Crete, especially the sprawling ruins at Knossos, where rooms, corridors, stairways, and courtyards create a sense of careful but bewildering movement. To walk through such a place, especially without maps or modern lighting, would already feel like entering a pattern that keeps folding back on itself. Over time, that physical impression may have grown into a symbolic one. The labyrinth becomes not just a building, but a state of mind, a place where direction dissolves and certainty becomes difficult to hold. The Minotaur belongs there because the creature itself is a kind of living confusion, a being made to embody the same uncertainty that the maze produces in anyone who enters it. The Minotaur's appetite is one of the most famous parts of the myth, and yet it is worth pausing over how carefully ancient stories use that detail. He is usually described as devouring human victims sent as tribute from Athens, a terrible arrangement that turns political power into ritual horror. The image is gruesome, but in mythic language it also serves a larger purpose. The Minotaur is not merely hungry in the ordinary sense. His hunger stands for domination, for the consuming force of fear, for the way a stronger power can turn people into offerings. The tribute itself suggests subjugation. Young men and women, chosen and sent away, vanish into the maze and do not return. In that way, the monster becomes part of the machinery of a city's humiliation. His appetite is less about animal behavior than about the ancient nightmare of being helpless before a power that cannot be reasoned with. This is one reason the myth remains so vivid. It captures the anxious feeling that some forces in the world are not interested in negotiation, only in taking what they have been given. And yet, for all its darkness, the Minotaur myth is also tied to the broader political identity of Crete, especially in the way later Greeks imagined the island's ancient strength. Minos is often treated as a stern and imposing ruler, sometimes even as one of the judges of the dead in later tradition, which gives his household story an additional weight. The myth may reflect a memory, however distorted, of Minoan Crete as a sophisticated maritime power whose culture seemed old and impressive to mainland Greeks. Their stories could admire and fear Crete at the same time. The Minotaur then becomes a sort of cultural shadow, a monstrous figure at the heart of a wealthy and ordered society. That contradiction is part of the myth's power. The palace is grand, the king is mighty, the sea routes are active, the treasures are abundant, and still something hidden and terrible lives underneath. Ancient myth often likes this kind of contrast. It suggests that even the most polished civilization may contain a secret chamber where beauty and dread remain locked together. When the Athenian hero Theseus enters the story, the Minotaur's role changes again. The monster is no longer just the end point of a curse or tribute. He becomes the challenge that proves a hero's worth. This is a familiar pattern in Greek myth, where a monster often serves as a threshold between one world and another. Theseus travels to Crete as part of the doomed tribute, but he also brings with him the possibility of release. Later versions of the myth give him help from Ariadne, Minos' daughter, who offers him the famous thread that lets him find his way back out of the labyrinth. This detail is so elegant because it gently opposes the nature of the maze. If the labyrinth represents confusion, then the thread represents memory, continuity, and trust. Against the dark inward pull of the Minotaur's prison, the thin line of string becomes a humble but powerful kind of wisdom. And in that setting, the Minotaur himself becomes more than a beast to be slain. He is the reason the thread matters. Without the monster, there is no need for the careful path, no need for a return. The story is built around the tension between getting lost and making your way home. Some ancient sources, however, suggest a different way of reading the Minotaur, and this is where the myth becomes especially interesting. Rather than a literal beast, he may preserve memories of bull symbolism in Cretan religion and culture. Bulls were clearly important in the ancient Aegean world, appearing in art, ritual, and palace imagery. Frescoes from Crete show acrobatic bull-leaping scenes, in which figures seem to vault over the animal with astonishing agility and control. Whether these images reflect religious ceremony, athletic display, or some combination of both, they tell us that the bull was not simply an ordinary farm animal. It held a charged place in the imagination. The Minotaur could therefore be understood as a later Greek reworking of older bull-centered traditions, transformed by storytellers into a figure of danger and exile. This does not weaken the myth. If anything, it deepens it. A creature with a bull's body and a human mind sits at the crossroads between historical memory and poetic invention, preserving something ancient while also becoming something entirely its own. The Minotaur's body itself has always invited contemplation because it is such a precise image of divided nature. In most descriptions, he has the head of a bull and the body of a man, or sometimes the reverse emphasis is blurred in the retelling, but the effect is the same. a composite being whose parts do not belong naturally together. Greek myth often creates such hybrids to express anxiety about boundaries. The centaur, the sphinx, the harpy, and other strange beings all occupy that same emotional space, where one identity has not fully replaced another. The Minotaur, though, feels especially intimate because his human half suggests recognition. There is something almost unsettling in the possibility of a mind behind those animal features. He is not merely external danger. He is a being who might think, feel, or suffer, even as the myth presents him as a threat. That ambiguity has made later audiences continue to wonder about him. Is he a brute, a victim, a cursed royal child, a symbol of human appetite? The ancient texts do not settle the matter, and perhaps that uncertainty is part of the story's lasting resonance. A creature that is hard to define is often the one that remains in the imagination the longest. Later writers, especially in the Roman period and beyond, sometimes gave the Minotaur a more tragic edge. The monster could be portrayed less as pure evil and more as an isolated being, hidden away from the world that produced him. This shift matters because it changes the mood of the labyrinth. Instead of a simple hunting ground for a hero, the maze becomes a place of confinement, a sad architecture built to contain a family's shame. The Minotaur then appears not only as a danger to others but as a prisoner of his own existence. He is fed not because he is wild in a natural sense, but because the system around him requires that he remain alive and hidden. In some modern interpretations, this makes him almost pitiable. He is born into a story that gives him no ordinary place in the world. No village, no court, no sanctuary, no field, only corridors, only echo, only the slow approach of footsteps from outside. Such readings are not identical to the ancient versions, but they arise naturally from the emotional structure of the myth, which always seems to hover between horror and sadness, aggression and exile. The Minotaur also survives because artists have always been drawn to the visual power of his image. Ancient vase painters, sculptors, and later illustrators found in him a perfect subject for dramatic contrast. The bull's head can be rendered with heavy brow and snout, the human body with tense muscles and twisted posture, creating a figure that feels at once familiar and impossible. In art, the Minotaur is often shown at the moment of struggle, when Theseus closes in or when the creature resists in a confined space. That visual tension mirrors the story's larger meaning. The eye follows the curves of the body, the angle of the horns, the sense of enclosed motion, and one can almost feel the stone of the labyrinth around him. Even in still images, the Minotaur seems to move. This is part of why he endured across centuries. He is visually unforgettable. A simple animal would not be enough, and a simple man would not be enough. The combination creates an image that is immediately legible and yet impossible to fully resolve. Over time, the Minotaur left the strict boundaries of Greek myth and entered a broader symbolic life. Writers and thinkers began to use him as a metaphor for hidden violence, instinct, desire, and the difficult parts of the self. The labyrinth, too, became a mental image as much as a physical one, standing for confusion, inward struggle, or the search for meaning through complexity. In this sense, the Minotaur became less a single mythological character and more a recurring figure of thought. He appears in modern poetry, fiction, philosophy, and psychoanalysis, often as a presence in the depths of the mind. This later symbolism is not identical to the old story, but it grows naturally from it. A creature half human, half bull, hidden in a maze, already invites metaphor. He is the kind of being that can represent what a culture fears to look at directly. Sometimes that means brute force, sometimes it means desire, sometimes it means the untidy parts of identity that do not fit neatly into daylight. The old Cretan monster, therefore, continues to wander far beyond his original walls, quietly inhabiting new languages of interpretation. And so the Minotaur remains one of the most enduring figures in myth because he gathers so many kinds of meaning into a single shadowed form. He is a family curse, a political symbol, a relic of older bull traditions, a prisoner, a threat, and perhaps even a sorrowful remnant of something sacred that has gone awry. The details of his story shift from source to source, but the atmosphere stays remarkably stable. The dim palace, the deep corridors, the silent danger, the thin thread of escape, the strange possibility that the monster is also a mirror. Ancient audiences may have shivered at his appetite, but they also recognized in him a story about limits and transgression, about what happens when order is strained too far. That is why the Minotaur continues to feel alive in the imagination. He does not vanish with the hero's victory. He lingers in the architecture of the myth, in the echo of footsteps, in the dark center of the maze, where history, ritual, and invention softly overlap. In many old tellings, the Minotaur is not simply a monster waiting in a maze, but the visible sign of a broken order. The story begins with a gift that should have been honored and instead was misused, and that misuse leads to a being neither fully human nor fully beast. In that way, the Minotaur can be read as a myth about consequence, the kind that ancient listeners may have recognized in the hush after a bad decision has already taken root. He lives at the center of a palace complex, yet he also seems to belong to the deep, shadowed parts of the imagination, where shame and secrecy gather. Some scholars have suggested that the monster reflects older ritual memories from Crete, while others think he is mainly a Greek invention used to explain a foreign and unsettling power. Either way, the Minotaur stands as a creature formed by tension, as if two worlds had collided and never quite separated again. That uneasy blending is part of what makes him so enduring. He is not just a beast in confinement, but a symbol of a household, a kingdom, and perhaps a civilization trying to hide the cost of its own pride. A detail that often goes unnoticed is how deeply the Minotaur belongs to the architecture around him. The famous maze or labyrinth is not merely a prison in later imagination, but a central feature of the story itself. In ancient Greek thought, a labyrinth could suggest complexity, confusion, and the difficulty of finding a lawful way out of a situation once one has entered it. The very word has inspired centuries of debate, and no single explanation has fully settled the matter. Some have connected it to the double axe, the labyrinth, a symbol found in Minoan art, while others treat the similarity as uncertain and perhaps coincidental. What matters for the myth is the feeling of wandering, of moving through corridors that turn one's sense of direction into something fragile and dreamlike. A maze does not need to be physically huge to feel impossible. It only needs to undermine confidence in the path ahead. For the Minotaur, that enclosed space becomes part of his identity. He is a creature defined not only by his body, but by the pattern of stone and shadow that holds him. In sleep, this image can become strangely soothing, because the labyrinth, while frightening, is also orderly in its own way, a structure with a hidden logic even when the way through is obscure. The Minotaur's hunger is another part of the tale that has echoed across centuries. In the oldest literary versions, he is fed with human tribute, a grim arrangement that reveals more about political fear than about the creature himself. The annual offering of youths from Athens to Crete can be understood as a mythic memory of domination, perhaps linked to the idea of one city paying a terrible price to another. In this sense, the Minotaur is not only a devourer, but also a receiver of a social bargain that has gone horribly wrong. He consumes what is sent to him, yet he does not choose the terms of his appetite. The ancient audience may have felt the unease of that arrangement. The violence is both personal and institutional, both monstrous and bureaucratic. Later retellings often emphasize the hero who ends the tribute, but the older shape of the story lingers in the background, with its quiet suggestion that fear can become habitual when power is unevenly distributed. The Minotaur's feeding is repeated, ceremonial, almost administrative, which makes the horror feel colder and more formal. It is a reminder that myths often describe not only dramatic acts, but the slow routines by which suffering is maintained. When people picture the Minotaur, They often imagine a bull-headed giant, yet the details vary more than one might expect. Ancient vase paintings and later artworks do not always present the same anatomy or expression. Sometimes he appears fully human except for the head, sometimes more animal in posture, with the heaviness of a beast and the sadness of a captive. The most familiar image today is shaped largely by later art, literature, and modern fantasy, which have standardized a creature that was once far less fixed. This flexibility may be part of why the Minotaur remains compelling. He occupies the borderland between categories, and borderland creatures are often the most memorable. In the ancient Mediterranean, the bull carried immense symbolic force. It could represent strength, fertility, royal authority, and danger all at once. So the Minotaur is not merely an odd hybrid, but a concentrated image of power made unstable. A bull is impressive from a distance, but intimate and close it becomes overwhelming, even frightening. The human face and the animal head together create a tension that seems almost sad, as though reason and instinct had been forced to share one body without ever reconciling. That mixture gives the Minotaur a strange tenderness beneath the menace, a quality that later artists sometimes tried to bring forward with softened eyes or a bowed posture. A quieter strand of the myth lies in the role of Daedalus, the craftsman associated with both invention and trouble. He is the builder of the labyrinth in many versions, a man of genius whose creations outlive his intentions. In Greek myth, skilled artisans are often admired and mistrusted at the same time, because making something powerful does not guarantee wisdom in using it. Daedalus can be seen as a figure of technical brilliance, the kind that solves one problem only to produce another, larger one. The labyrinth is his masterpiece and his burden. It is carefully designed, but it traps not only the monster, it also reflects the limits of human control. There is something quietly unsettling about that. A builder can imagine an enclosure so clever that even its creator may not fully master it. The story therefore touches a timeless concern. What happens when design becomes more intricate than the moral thought behind it? Daedalus later escapes by using wings, another invention that carries both wonder and peril. In this way, the Minotaur's world is surrounded by acts of human ingenuity, each one beautiful and slightly dangerous. The myth seems to whisper that intelligence, when separated from restraint, can become its own kind of maze. The Minotaur is also closely tied to sacrifice, and sacrifice in the ancient world was never a simple matter. To modern readers, it can appear only as violence, but to ancient communities it often carried ideas of exchange, order, and communion with divine powers. In the Cretan setting of the myth, the creature at the center of the labyrinth may echo older rites involving bulls, which were significant across the Aegean world. Bulls were powerful animals, associated with fertility and sacred strength, and their presence in art and ritual suggests a respect mixed with awe. Some researchers have wondered whether the story preserves distorted memories of bull-leaping ceremonies or palace rituals at Knossos, though this remains speculative. Even if the myth is not a direct record, it clearly draws energy from a landscape where bulls mattered deeply. The Minotaur, then, may reflect the transformation of ritual symbolism into narrative horror. What was once sacred becomes feared. What was once honored becomes hidden. That shift is part of why the myth feels so emotionally layered. The same animal that could stand for life and abundance also becomes the mouth through which tribute disappears. The story gently reminds us that symbols rarely stay still. Over time, they can harden, darken, and take on a new face in the imagination. The hero who confronts the Minotaur, Theseus, is often placed at the center of the tale, yet the monster remains strangely essential to his identity. Without the Minotaur, Theseus is simply another prince among many. With the Minotaur, he becomes a figure who proves himself by entering uncertainty and surviving it. This is one reason the myth has remained popular in later literature. It offers a dramatic test, but the test is not just physical. The true challenge lies in entering a place built to dissolve confidence. The thread given by Ariadne is one of the loveliest details in the story, and also one of the most practical. It suggests that intelligence, memory, and assistance can matter as much as courage. The Minotaur is defeated not by raw force alone, but by a combination of bravery, guidance, and a way back. In that sense, the creature's defeat is less a triumphant battle than a successful navigation of danger. The labyrinth becomes a stage for human vulnerability. Theseus descends into darkness with a plan, but plans are only useful if they can survive confusion. The Minotaur's presence gives the story its gravity, while the thread offers the faint, reassuring possibility that even complicated darkness can be retraced. There is also a fascinating uncertainty about where the Minotaur belongs within the broader world of Greek myth. He is deeply connected to Crete, yet the surviving tales about him were preserved and reshaped by Greeks of later mainland traditions. That means the myth we know is already a layered artifact, filtered through time, politics, and literary taste. Ancient Athens, in particular, had reasons to tell stories about Crete that emphasized Athenian heroism and Cretan strangeness. Myths often carry these cultural shadows. They are not neutral records, they are conversations between regions, generations, and rival identities. The Minotaur may therefore represent, in part, how one culture imagined another, powerful, opulent, secretive, and difficult to understand. At the same time, the persistence of Cretan imagery suggests genuine fascination, not just suspicion. The result is a tale that feels both intimate and foreign. You can sense a storyteller trying to explain something ancient and half-remembered, while also shaping it into a moral drama. That double nature gives the myth a soft historical haze, as though it were being viewed through distance and candlelight. It is not strange that people keep returning to it, because the uncertainty itself is part of the atmosphere. In later philosophical and literary readings, the Minotaur can be understood as an image of the split self. The human and animal halves do not simply coexist, they remain in uneasy tension. Ancient Greeks often reflected on the balance between reason and appetite, order and impulse, public form and private instinct. The Minotaur makes that tension visible. He is not evil in the moral sense of a calculating villain. Rather, he is a body that dramatizes a conflict that could exist in any person. This is one reason the myth has such lasting psychological appeal. It can be read as a story about what happens when desire is trapped, distorted, or denied until it becomes monstrous. In that reading, the labyrinth is not only a building but a mind. The corridors are habits, fears, and evasions. The creature at the center is the part of us that cannot be reasoned away because it was never fully understood to begin with. Such interpretations are modern, of course, but they draw from something already present in the ancient material, the sense that the Minotaur is as much an inward symbol as an outward enemy. He invites reflection rather than simple terror, and that reflective quality is part of why he remains so haunting in quiet moments. The Minotaur's fame has also changed over time, and with each era he has been softened, sharpened, or reimagined according to new tastes. Roman authors retold the Greek myths in their own style, later medieval writers preserved fragments of the story, and modern novelists, painters, and filmmakers have given the creature new emotional colors. Sometimes he is brute force, sometimes tragic exile, sometimes a lonely being misunderstood by the world that made him. These changes say as much about the audience as about the myth itself. Every age seems to ask the Minotaur a different question. Is he punishment, destiny, or simply a victim of cruel circumstances? Is he a monster because he kills, or because he was never allowed a life beyond the maze? The answers shift, but the figure remains. That durability suggests that the Minotaur touches a deep and flexible nerve in storytelling. He can embody fear, but he can also embody pity, especially when viewed from the narrow perspective of a creature confined by fate. In sleep-friendly retellings, this softer angle can be especially calming because it transforms the myth from pure threat into something more contemplative. a reminder that even in the oldest stories, beings of darkness are often surrounded by sadness, not just violence. At the edge of the myth, there is a final small mystery: why a creature so terrifying should also feel strangely lonely. The Minotaur is one of the great solitary figures of antiquity. He does not belong in a herd, a household, or a heroic company. He is kept apart, hidden in the center of the structure, where sound would echo and footsteps would arrive only when it was already too late. That isolation makes the labyrinth feel almost like a silent room in the mind, a place where thought loops back on itself. Ancient audiences may have imagined him roaring, but later readers often imagine stillness first, the sort of stillness that comes before a door opens. In this quiet, the Minotaur becomes less a symbol of chaos than of containment. His world is enclosed, repetitive, and doomed to remain unfinished. He is a creature of boundaries, and perhaps that is why the myth lingers so powerfully. It suggests that the things we fear most are sometimes those that have been separated, named, and locked away, yet never truly understood. In that shadowed enclosure, the Minotaur remains, not only as a monster from an ancient tale, but as an enduring image of what happens when power, secrecy, and sorrow are allowed to grow together in the dark. In the oldest layers of the Minotaur story, the monster is not simply a creature with a bull's head and a man's body, but a sign of something far older and more uncertain, almost like a shadow cast by another civilization. Many scholars have wondered whether the myth preserves a distant memory of the Minoan world itself, where bulls seem to have held a special place in ritual life and artistic imagination. Frescoes from Crete show young people leaping over bulls in gestures that feel both graceful and dangerous, and the Palace of Knossos, with its winding corridors, may have helped later storytellers imagine a place so complicated that escape from it seemed impossible. Yet the Minotaur, as we know him, is not a direct historical record. He is a mythic condensation, a dream image made from fragments of bull reverence, political memory, and Greek fascination with what lay beyond the limits of ordered city life. The name itself is quietly revealing. Minotaur means, quite simply, the bull of Minos, joining the figure to the king of Crete, as though the beast were not merely a monster, but an extension of royal power, guilt, or inheritance. That link makes the creature feel less like an isolated horror and more like a family secret given shape. In ancient storytelling, names often carry a kind of slow significance, and here the naming suggests possession, belonging, and burden all at once. The beast is not from nowhere. He belongs to a household, a dynasty, a court, a sealed architectural world where human choices seem to grow into something larger than the people who made them. Even the sound of the word has a heavy, old texture, as if it were built from stone and ritual rather than from ordinary speech. And in that weight, the Minotaur becomes more than a monster in a maze. He becomes a legend of entanglement, the kind that cannot be separated cleanly into innocence and blame. Much of the Minotaur's story depends on the labyrinth, and the labyrinth is not just a setting but a mood. In later imagination, it becomes a perfectly designed prison with a single deadly inhabitant, but in earlier thought the idea may have been closer to a great palatial complex, a sprawling and confusing place of corridors, storerooms, stairways, and hidden turns. To a visitor, such a structure could feel almost alive, as though the walls were guiding or misleading the body with every step. The word labyrinth itself has ancient and mysterious associations, sometimes linked with the double-axe symbol seen in Minoan art, though scholars debate how directly these connections should be understood. What matters is that the labyrinth gives the myth its slow architecture of dread. It is a place where direction loses meaning, where sound softens, where one turn resembles another, and where memory must compete with confusion. In that sense, the Minotaur's home is not merely a cage. It is a mental landscape, a dream of being unable to find the way back out. The famous tribute from Athens to Crete, in which young men and women are sent to be fed to the beast, carries the atmosphere of political memory turned into ritual sorrow. Whether or not any historical event lies behind it, the story reflects an older sense of dependence and humiliation, as if one city had once stood beneath the power of another. The 7 youths and 7 maidens, or sometimes other numbers depending on the version, become symbols of civic vulnerability. Their journey across the sea is quiet before it is tragic, marked by the slow movement of a ship and the uneasy certainty of return or loss. In the myth, these offerings are not described with graphic emphasis. Instead, the horror comes from their regularity. A sacrifice repeated over time becomes colder than a single act of violence. It becomes routine. That repeated silence, the waiting in Athens, the voyage to Crete, and the sealed interior of the labyrinth all work together to create one of the most enduring images in Greek myth. The idea that civilization itself can demand a terrible price for stability. Theseus enters that darkness not as a simple hero, but as a figure shaped by both bravery and calculation. He is often remembered for defeating the Minotaur, yet his success depends on an elegant piece of assistance, the thread given to him by Ariadne. That detail matters because it transforms the monster-slaying story into one of navigation, intelligence, and trust. The thread is a small thing, soft and ordinary, but in the maze it becomes a lifeline, a memory trail, a promise that one can leave a place of confusion if a path is carefully marked. This is one reason the myth has lasted so long in the imagination. The hero does not merely overpower the beast, he survives by accepting help. There is a calm wisdom in that, almost domestic in scale, even as the setting is one of terror. The thread, unspooling slowly through stone passages, seems like the opposite of the labyrinth's hard complexity. It is flexible, human, and delicate, and yet it defeats what force alone cannot. Ariadne herself stands at the center of one of the most quietly painful parts of the story. She is often remembered for helping Theseus escape, but her own position is unsettled, and her loyalty moves through the myth like a breeze that changes direction. In some versions, she falls in love with Theseus at first sight, while in others she is guided by divine influence or by a deeper recognition that the monster must be ended. After the escape, she is sometimes abandoned on Naxos, left behind on an island shore where the sea continues its patient motion, and the heroine's role seems to dissolve into uncertainty. This abandonment gives the myth a softer and sadder edge. The story is not only about victory over the beast, it is also about what happens to the people who make victory possible and then disappear from the triumph itself. Ariadne's thread, then, is more than a tool. It is a fragment of her presence, one of the few things she can leave behind in a world that does not always keep faith with women's labor, insight, or sacrifice. The Minotaur's form, too, carries a strange symbolic balance. He is neither fully human nor fully animal, and that in-betweenness is part of what makes him feel so unsettling. The bull in many ancient cultures suggests strength, fertility, stubborn vitality, and sacred force. The human body, by contrast, brings consciousness, speech, and moral vulnerability. Joined together, they create a being that seems to belong to both instinct and reason without being at home in either. This hybrid quality is not unique to the Minotaur, of course. Mythic traditions around the world often imagine creatures that stand at the boundary of species, as if the edges of the world were soft and could be crossed in dreams. But the Minotaur is especially poignant because he is not portrayed as a ruler of a beast kingdom. He is confined, hidden, and fed in isolation. The result is a creature of enormous power who is also trapped, a being whose violence may be inseparable from his own condition. That ambiguity gives the tale a lingering sadness beneath its surface of fear. Ancient artists loved to render the Minotaur in scenes of struggle, and later Roman and Greek works often present him with a stillness that makes the violence feel more ceremonial than chaotic. On pottery, reliefs, and mosaics, Theseus and the monster can look almost balanced, as if one were the dark reflection of the other. This visual symmetry may have helped audiences think about the myth as more than an adventure story. It becomes a confrontation between the civilized hero and the untamed creature, yes, but also between mirrored parts of the same world. The clean lines of a vase painting contrast with the implied darkness of the labyrinth. In some artistic depictions, the Minotaur's bull features appear calm rather than raging, and that calmness is deeply affecting. It suggests not frenzy, but inevitability. The battle is already decided in the composition of the myth, even before the spear is raised. And in this way, the image invites contemplation rather than shock. It is almost meditative, the way repeated forms and balanced lines can settle the mind while still carrying ancient tension. There is also a deeper political resonance in the Minotaur's story, one that has attracted historians for generations. Athens, Crete, kingship, tribute, maritime travel, and the defeat of a monstrous centaur all echo the concerns of societies thinking about power, identity, and inheritance. The myth may have helped later Greeks imagine themselves as heirs to a victory over foreign dominance, transforming older Cretan prestige into a story of liberation. Yet because myths are rarely simple propaganda, the tale also preserves admiration for the richness and strangeness of Crete. The island is not just a place of danger, it is a place of splendor, complexity, and formidable royal architecture. Minos himself is not merely a villain, and the island's culture is not reduced to darkness. Instead, the story balances awe and resistance. That balance is part of why it remains so enduring. The labyrinth may stand for oppression, but it also stands for sophistication. The culture that built such a place could not easily be dismissed. In sleep-friendly terms, it is a story of power that is both beautiful and unsettling, like moonlight on a palace wall. The death of the Minotaur is often presented as a clean ending, yet the myth is never fully tidy. In some tellings, Theseus kills the beast with a sword. In others, the details shift, as myths tend to do when carried from poet to poet and century to century. But the important thing is not the exact motion of the final blow. It is the sense that the monster's end closes one cycle without resolving the sorrow around it. The tribute ends, the labyrinth is breached, and a hero returns home, but memory does not settle so quickly. There are still parents waiting on the shore, still the consequences of promises made and forgotten, still the unresolved question of what the beast actually was. Was he punishment? Was he curse? Was he the living result of a broken order? Ancient audiences may have accepted the uncertainty more readily than modern readers, because myth itself was a place where contradiction could remain intact. In that way, the Minotaur's death is less a conclusion than a soft opening into another set of questions, ones that do not demand immediate answers. Perhaps that is why the Minotaur continues to appear in art, literature, and psychology long after the world that first told his story has vanished. He is a figure of enclosure, appetite, and estrangement, but also of wounded identity and hidden history. He lives in a maze because so many human fears do. We fear getting lost, being trapped, being misunderstood, becoming the thing others most dread. Yet the myth also carries the possibility of passage. There is a thread, there is a way back. Even the darkest corridors may be crossed by patience, trust, and a small, faithful line of memory. And so the Minotaur remains, not just as a monster waiting in the center of a maze, but as one of the oldest reminders that the most complicated places in the world are often the ones we build from power, fear, and the longing to be understood. By the time the Minotaur appears in the surviving myths, he is already a creature made from layers of older ideas, as if several ancient stories have quietly braided together into one memorable shape. One of the most enduring details is his confinement in the labyrinth, not simply as a prison, but as a symbol of difficult winding systems that humans create and then struggle to understand. In the oldest telling, the labyrinth is not described as a neat puzzle box for entertainment. It is something more unsettling and more architectural, a place with such elaborate turns that escape becomes almost unimaginable. Later writers would lean into this image because it suited the Minotaur so well. He is not just a beast in a maze. He is a creature made for the maze, almost as if the two were born together. Ancient readers may have imagined the echoing dark, the cool stone, the smell of damp earth and bronze, and the strange way a person could feel both trapped and tiny inside such a structure. Even today, when people speak of a labyrinth, they often mean confusion itself, and that meaning comes partly from the Minotaur's long association with enclosed, bewildering space. There is also a quieter detail in the myth that often passes unnoticed. The Minotaur is not always depicted as raging continuously. In some retellings, he is more like a starving, restless presence waiting in the depths, a creature whose danger comes from hunger, isolation, and the fact that he has been shut away from any normal life. That makes him feel less like a comic monster and more like a tragic one. The beast is often said to have been fed by the periodic tribute of young people from Athens, which gives the story its dark rhythm. Instead of a single dramatic battle, the myth suggests a recurring human cost, repeated over time with ceremonial calm. The Minotaur becomes part of a cruel system, a hidden endpoint for political humiliation and fear. It is easy to focus only on Theseus and the moment of slaying, but the longer shape of the story is about confinement, maintenance, and the unsettling regularity of violence. That repeating cycle may be one reason the myth stayed so powerful. It feels less like a one-time adventure and more like a problem that society allowed to continue until someone finally entered the dark to end it. The name itself has invited centuries of discussion, and even now scholars are careful when explaining what Minotaur really means. The Minos part ties the creature to King Minos of Crete, while the second element connects to the Greek word for bull, tauros. So the name is not random. It declares in a compact and severe way that this is the bull associated with Minos. That linguistic clarity, however, contrasts with the myth's emotional ambiguity. The Minotaur is called the offspring of Pasiphae and a bull, but the exact nature of this union is a matter of old narrative logic rather than biological realism. Ancient myth often speaks in the language of lineage, fate, and divine punishment rather than scientific explanation. The result is a name that sounds almost administrative, as though the creature were catalogued by court record, while the story around it grows ever stranger and more symbolic. This tension between the precise and the impossible gives the Minotaur a special kind of mythic solidity. He feels both official and unreal, as if he were recorded somewhere in a royal archive that no one can quite reach. Another important part of the tradition is the role of Pasiphae, whose story gives the Minotaur his most unsettling origin. In the classical version, her desire is not simple human desire at all, but the result of divine interference, often linked to Poseidon's punishment of Minos. The gods in these tales do not merely observe human life from a distance, they shape it, distort it, and sometimes make private suffering into public destiny. Pasiphae's fate is told in language that mixes shame, enchantment, and inevitability. The Minotaur, then, is not born from a normal household or a straightforward act of passion, but from an extraordinary collision of human royalty, divine anger, and animal form. Ancient audiences would have recognized how disturbing this was, because it places the child of the story outside ordinary categories from the beginning. He is neither fully human nor fully beast, and he inherits the consequences of a conflict that began before his own existence. That sense of inherited burden is central to the myth. The Minotaur is not only dangerous, he is the visible result of a curse that has taken shape and begun to breathe. From a historical perspective, the Minotaur also reflects how the Greeks imagined Crete itself. To them, Crete was an island of great antiquity, wealth, and mystery, connected to stories of maritime power and older royal traditions. The myth of a bull-headed monster inside a royal labyrinth may preserve, in distorted form, distant memories of Cretan architecture, ritual, or courtly spectacle. Some scholars have wondered whether the story echoes the prominence of bulls in Minoan culture, where bull imagery appears in frescoes, seals, and ceremonial scenes. The famous leaping over the bull images from ancient Crete do not prove the Minotaur existed in any literal sense, of course, but they may help explain why a bull-centered myth felt so natural in that setting. When later Greeks retold the story, they may have transformed older cultural symbols into a dramatic tale of monster, tribute, and heroism. In this way, the Minotaur becomes not only a creature of legend, but also a memory of cultural contact, an Athenian story about Crete, and perhaps also a Greek way of reimagining something genuinely ancient and unfamiliar. The weapon Theseus uses to defeat the Minotaur is often imagined as a sword, but the details are not always identical across sources, and that variation is part of the myth's long life. Sometimes Theseus strikes directly after following Ariadne's thread through the labyrinth. Sometimes the emphasis falls less on the blow itself and more on the fact that he could find the creature at all. The real triumph, in a sense, is not strength but orientation. The thread is a soft, simple object, almost humble, and it defeats the disorienting vastness of the maze. This gives the encounter a lovely contrast. One of the most famous monsters in literature is undone not by brilliance alone, but by patience and a practical line of yarn. There is something soothing in that image, especially in the way it turns complex danger into a matter of remembering one's way back. The Minotaur, hidden in deep corridors, becomes vulnerable to a small human solution. Ancient storytellers may not have intended it as a lesson in mindfulness, yet it has that feeling. A winding place can only hold power so long as no one carries a thread. The silence around the Minotaur is also worth noticing. Unlike some later monsters that roar, speak, or bargain, the Minotaur is usually mute. He communicates, if at all, through movement, physical threat, and presence. That silence makes him more atmospheric than theatrical. He is the kind of creature that belongs in shadow, where sound itself changes and footsteps feel louder than they should. In a literary sense, this muteness preserves a boundary between human language and animal force. The Minotaur is not given speeches because myths often reserve speech for gods, kings, and heroes. The monster stands at the edge of the human world, making noise with breath and body rather than with words. This can make him feel strangely lonely. A creature half made of human lineage, yet denied the ordinary ease of human speech, becomes a symbol of estrangement. Later artists and writers often tried to soften or complicate this silence by portraying the Minotaur as thoughtful, sorrowful, or even gentle. But in the earliest mythic frame, his quiet remains powerful. It is the quiet of an enclosed place, where danger waits without needing to announce itself. There is a deep moral unease in the tribute stories, because the Minotaur's victims are not warriors in battle but young people selected from the civic body of Athens. Their presence in the myth adds ritual weight and political meaning. This is not random feeding. It is a formalized offering, and that formality makes the horror more restrained, and therefore perhaps more disturbing. The idea that a city would surrender its youth to a far-off power suggests a world in which sovereignty and humiliation are tightly bound together. Ancient myths often use such arrangements to comment on the vulnerability of communities under stronger rulers. The Minotaur, though central to the drama, is only one part of the mechanism. He is the final point of a chain that begins with kings, debts, and divine punishment. That is why the myth can feel broader than a simple monster story. It is really about the cost of political failure, the lingering effects of pride, and the way a single household conflict can become a public tragedy. The beast in the center is terrible, yes, but the system around him is what keeps the darkness going. The Minotaur's image changed notably in later art, and those changes reveal how flexible the monster really is. In Greek vase painting, he can appear as a powerful human-bodied figure with a bull's head, emphasizing his physical force and strange hybridity. In later Roman and Renaissance art, he is sometimes rendered with more anatomical realism, as if artists were trying to make his impossible body feel almost believable. Modern depictions, by contrast, often lean into pathos, giving him a hunched posture or a look of inward sadness. Each era seems to ask a different question. Is he a brute, a victim, a punishment, or a symbol? The answer shifts depending on the medium, yet the bull-headed form remains instantly recognizable, perhaps because it communicates so much with very little. The broad neck, the heavy gaze, the animal face set against a human torso, these elements produce an immediate tension. They remind viewers that myth has always enjoyed crossing categories. The Minotaur endures not because his design is simple, but because his design holds contradictions so elegantly in place. Even the thread of Ariadne, when placed beside the Minotaur, says something about how ancient cultures imagined knowledge. The labyrinth is an image of secrecy and confusion, but the thread introduces continuity, memory, and the possibility of return. In some later interpretations, the thread becomes more than a practical tool. It becomes a metaphor for narrative itself. A story, after all, is a line we follow through complication. The Minotaur would then represent the central fear at the heart of the tale, what waits in the deepest part of an uncertain structure. Yet the thread assures us that a root exists through the darkness, even if it must be unwound carefully. This pairing, monster and thread, has made the myth especially influential for philosophers, psychologists, and artists, who have all found in it a way to talk about inward journeys, hidden selves, and the challenge of returning from confusion with some part of oneself intact. In that sense, the Minotaur is not only a beast to be defeated, he is also the shape of the problem one must move through, slowly and consciously, to emerge into clearer air. And perhaps that is why the Minotaur still feels strangely modern. He is ancient but not remote. He belongs to a world of kings and gods, yet he also appears in essays, paintings, and novels as a figure for inner struggle, enclosed violence, and misunderstood identity. He can stand for the fearful center of a city, the shadowed center of a mind, or the hidden center of a story that must be approached one step at a time. The old myth never fully settles what he is meant to mean, and that uncertainty gives him a long life. He remains suspended between nature and culture, punishment and innocence, animality and inheritance. In the quiet of the labyrinth, he waits as a reminder that some of the oldest monsters are also the most human in the questions they leave behind. In many ancient retellings, the Minotaur is not simply a monster living in a maze, but a being shaped by a long chain of human choices, divine punishment, and royal embarrassment. That detail gives the creature a strange kind of tragic weight. The Minotaur belongs to a story in which people, gods, and kings all seem to be responsible, and no one can fully escape the consequences. A bull emerges from the sea, a queen is drawn into an unnatural union, and then a child is born who is neither fully human nor fully beast. In that sense, the Minotaur can be read less as a random horror and more as the final, silent result of disorder at the heart of a kingdom. Ancient audiences may have understood this as a warning that when rulers offend the sacred order, the punishment does not arrive in a neat or simple form. It grows slowly, almost architecturally, until it must be hidden away underground. The labyrinth is not only a prison for the creature, it is also a physical expression of confusion, shame, and the effort to contain what cannot be comfortably explained. The famous labyrinth itself is one of the most mysterious elements in the whole tradition, because ancient writers describe it with certainty, yet archaeology cannot confirm that a single monumental maze like the literary version ever truly existed at Knossos. This uncertainty has made the labyrinth especially powerful in imagination. It may have been inspired by the complex layout of Minoan palaces, with their many corridors, staircases, storage rooms, and branching passageways, which could easily feel maze-like to a visitor. A newcomer might turn a corner and lose all sense of direction among the repeated walls and dim interior chambers. If so, the myth preserved not a literal building plan, but a memory of being disoriented in a vast royal complex. Later storytellers transformed that practical confusion into something much darker and more symbolic. The labyrinth became a place where space itself seems to misbehave, folding in on itself and refusing easy escape. For a sleep-time telling, it is easy to imagine those stone passageways holding the coolness of the earth, the smell of dust and oil lamps, and the muted echo of footsteps that never quite lead where they should. Another striking detail is that the Minotaur's name is not personal in the usual sense. It means, quite plainly, the bull of Minos. That makes the creature feel less like an individual and more like a title, almost as if the monster were a symbol attached to the king rather than an independent being with a private identity. In ancient culture, names often carried meaning that was more descriptive than intimate, and this one binds the creature directly to royal power. It suggests possession, responsibility, or perhaps even guilt. The beast is not just a bull-like being in some distant cave. It is the bull belonging to Minos, and by extension the kingdom's own hidden shame. This naming also helps explain why the myth feels so attached to the house of Minos as a whole. The monster is not an outside invader. It is born within the royal family's story, and therefore within the realm itself. Scholars sometimes point out that such naming can reveal how ancient myths worked as political memory. They kept the focus on dynasties, lineage, and the burdens that rulers could not remove simply by closing a door. The Minotaur's appetite for human flesh is one of the most famous parts of the myth, yet even this detail may have carried a deeper ritual meaning for ancient listeners. Human sacrifice is rare in the surviving Greek stories, but the idea of offering the vulnerable to appease a dangerous force appears again and again in mythic tradition. The tribute of Athenian youths and maidens sent to Crete may preserve a symbolic memory of subjugation, taxation, or political dominance rather than a literal historical practice. Still, the image is haunting. Young people chosen, counted, and dispatched into the palace to face a hidden terror. In that setting, the Minotaur becomes not only a predator but a receiver of offerings, a creature around whom dread is organized. The silence that follows such a sacrifice would have been immense. The palace continues, the sea continues, the island continues, and somewhere deep below, the beast is waiting. In a softer documentary sense, this may be why the myth endured so well. It combines the fear of violence with the fear of being selected for it, and the uncertainty of not knowing exactly where power ends and appetite begins. The story of Theseus is often remembered as a heroic rescue, but it is also carefully shaped by the presence of Ariadne, whose thread makes the ending possible. Without that slender guide, the labyrinth would remain a place of total loss. The thread is a wonderfully quiet object in a myth full of blood and stone. It is light, simple, and almost domestic, yet it becomes a tool against cosmic confusion. Some versions of the story say Ariadne gave Theseus a ball of thread so he could find his way back after killing the Minotaur. Others imply a string or yarn of some kind, which may reflect different stages of oral tradition. The image is almost soothing in its practicality. It reminds us that survival often depends not on force alone, but on orientation, memory, and a guide left by someone who understands the danger. Ariadne herself stands at the boundary between the palace and the open world, between loyalty and escape. Her gift is one of the loveliest elements in the myth, because it turns the labyrinth from an absolute prison into a problem that can be solved with patience and a line to follow. In a gentle retelling, the thread seems to move softly in the dark, as if knowledge itself were being unspooled. There is also an important question about whether the Minotaur was imagined as a single monstrous being from the beginning, or whether he emerged from older layers of bull symbolism in Aegean religion and art. Bulls were deeply significant in Minoan civilization, appearing in frescoes, vessels, seals, and ceremonial scenes. Some images show athletic figures vaulting over bulls, suggesting a culture in which the animal carried power, danger, and sacred importance all at once. The myth may have absorbed these older associations and transformed them into a more dramatic, moralized figure for later Greek storytelling. In that way, the Minotaur can be seen as part of a long conversation between ritual imagery and narrative imagination. The bull was not just a beast to be feared. It was a creature of fertility, force, and divine presence. When later Greeks reinterpreted the past, they may have woven those qualities together into a hybrid body that felt both ancient and unsettling. This is one reason the Minotaur remains so vivid. He stands at the intersection of religion, art, and story, where an image can slowly harden into a myth. And even now, the bull shape still carries that ancient pulse, strong and low, like distant hooves on packed earth. The architecture associated with Knossos has encouraged another enduring interpretation, that the labyrinth may have been a memory of the palace's actual ceremonial complexity, rather than a separate underground construction. The palace was vast, multi-leveled, and densely organized, with storerooms, courtyards, religious spaces, and administrative chambers arranged in a way that could seem bewildering. To someone entering from outside, the building would not present a single clear path. Instead, it would invite movement through repeated turns and layered thresholds. That kind of environment naturally lends itself to mythic exaggeration. Over time, a complicated residence can become a maze in the imagination, and a maze can become a prison for a monster. The palace's own grandeur may have helped inspire the story, because places of power often seem to conceal more than they reveal. Even the soft sound of water from clay pipes or the filtered light in inner courts could contribute to the sense that something hidden was moving beneath the visible order of the site. The labyrinth, then, might be less a fantastical invention than a memory of how monumental spaces feel from within, impressive, enclosing, and easy to lose oneself in. As the myth developed, the Minotaur came to represent more than violence. He also became a figure of separation, the extreme boundary between human civilization and what lies outside it. In the Greek imagination, the city, the household, and the ordered realm of law were always contrasted with wilderness, appetite, and ungoverned force. The Minotaur sits in the middle of that contrast because he is both inside and outside. He is kept within a human structure, yet he cannot belong to human society. He is born of royal lineage, but his body marks him as other. He is fed by political tribute, but he remains outside the ordinary economy of kinship and exchange. That tension gives the creature a peculiar stillness in the mind. He is not a roaming monster like a lion in the hills. He is contained, waiting, enclosed by civilization itself. This may be why the myth feels so unsettling. It suggests that the line between the ordered and the monstrous is not very far apart. One can build walls, gates, and corridors, and still find that what has been separated has not truly disappeared. It only sleeps deeper below the surface in a quieter chamber. The Minotaur's defeat by Theseus is sometimes told as a clean triumph, yet the story ends with several shades of sorrow and confusion. Theseus forgets to replace the black sails with white ones, according to one famous version, and his father Aegeus dies in grief when he sees the returning ship. So even the victory over the Minotaur is accompanied by another loss, another instance where misunderstanding turns the sea into a place of mourning. This gives the whole cycle a hushed, circular feeling. A monster is slain in the maze, but the homecoming is incomplete. A promise to signal success is forgotten. A father waits at the shore and then is broken by the sight of the wrong color on the horizon. Ancient myths often carry this kind of layered consequence, where one action resolves a danger but opens another wound. It is part of what makes them so enduring and so human. The battle is not merely between hero and beast. It is between fear and memory, between achievement and the fragility of signs. The sails fluttering in the wind become another quiet symbol, almost like a message that the world of myth never delivers closure in a single breath. Even the bodily form of the Minotaur seems carefully chosen to unsettle the viewer without making him wholly unbelievable. The human torso joined to the bull's head, and body creates a shape that is almost familiar. It combines intelligence and strength, gaze and charge, upright posture and animal mass. In art, such hybrid beings can suggest a tension between civilization and instinct, reason and force, self-control and raw physicality. The Minotaur is terrifying partly because he occupies the border where categories break down. He is not a beast with no mind, nor a man with a simple flaw. He is both and neither. Ancient myth often uses such hybrid bodies to explore what happens when lines blur. The result is not pure chaos, but a more ambiguous kind of reality, one in which identity itself becomes unstable. There is also a strange melancholy in this form, because the creature seems trapped in his own body as much as in the labyrinth. He cannot easily be imagined in a field under open sky or in a shared human home. He belongs to corridors, shadows, and enclosed spaces. That confinement gives the myth a soft, persistent sadness, even when the story is told as a victory. In the end, the Minotaur survives not as a historical fact, but as a remarkably adaptable symbol. He has been read as a monster of punishment, a relic of bull worship, a political allegory, a figure of appetite, a victim of royal shame, and a guardian of threshold fears. Each interpretation catches one aspect of the creature and lets the others remain in shadow. That flexibility is part of the myth's power. It invites every generation to place the Minotaur somewhere meaningful, in a palace, in a cave, in the subconscious, in the ruined memory of ancient ceremonies, or deep in the winding rooms of the mind. The creature never fully disappears because he is less a fixed being than a shape through which humans have long thought about danger and containment. And so, when the story is told slowly, the Minotaur does not feel noisy or frantic. He feels like an old presence, heavy and distant, moving somewhere below the floor of history. In one of the oldest ways of telling the Minotaur's story, he is not only a creature of violence, but also a consequence of a broken relationship between humans, animals, and the sacred order of the world. The ancient imagination often gave monstrous shape to moral imbalance, and the Minotaur became a kind of living archive of wrong desire, royal pride, and divine punishment. What makes the figure so enduring is that he seems to belong to several worlds at once. He is part bull, part man, but also part mythic warning, as if the Greeks wanted to pin an entire uneasy story onto a single impossible body. The bull, in many ancient cultures, was a symbol of force, fertility, and kingship, while the human head suggested reason, speech, and self-control. In the Minotaur, those two principles do not harmonize. They are trapped together, and that tension gives the creature his strange power. Some scholars have suggested that this is why he remains so memorable. He is less a monster in the ordinary sense than a dramatic image of nature and civilization, locked in an unresolved embrace. Even the silence of his labyrinth seems to fit this idea, because the maze is not only a prison, but a shape made from confusion itself, a place where meaning bends and turns back on itself until it becomes nearly dreamlike. The later Greeks did not simply inherit the Minotaur as a single fixed character. They received him through layers of older tradition, story, ritual memory, and regional identity, and that means his image was never completely stable. The name itself, often read as Bull of Minos, ties the creature to the Cretan king, but whether this reflects a literal origin or a poetic way of linking the beast to royal authority is hard to know. Ancient stories are rarely shy about blurring the line between person and symbol, and this one is especially rich in that regard. Minos becomes not just a ruler, but the human figure around whom the entire disaster gathers. The labyrinth, too, may have begun as more than a setting for adventure. Some historians have wondered whether the great complexity of palace architecture at Knossos, with its many corridors, rooms, and storage spaces, helped inspire the idea of a maze. Walking through such a structure in imagination, one can understand how later storytellers might have turned it into something vast, echoing, and nearly impossible to escape. The original emotional atmosphere of the myth may have come from this sense of immense, ordered complexity that still feels a little bewildering, a place where one can be lost even while standing inside civilization itself. Another quiet fascination of the Minotaur myth is that it preserves the ancient Greek habit of explaining danger through family history. The monster is not dropped into the world by accident. He is born from a chain of events involving Minos, Pasiphae, and the divine bull sent by Poseidon, and the story unfolds like a household tragedy enlarged to cosmic scale. Ancient audiences were deeply interested in the consequences of hubris, but they also understood the household, the royal line, and the inherited stain of wrongdoing as connected. In the Minotaur's case, the creature becomes the final embodiment of that inheritance. The shame of the parents is carried into the body of the child, though that child is not fully child, not fully animal, and not fully human. This uneasy birth gives the myth its lingering emotional weight. It is not only about punishment from above, but about the way one moment of imbalance can echo forward into a new generation. That pattern feels especially old, almost ritual in its structure, as if the myth were teaching that no private act remains private for long in the presence of gods. Yet the story never becomes simple moralizing. It remains strangely sympathetic to the brokenness it describes, and in that sympathy the Minotaur becomes more than a monster. He becomes a being whose existence itself is the result of forces too large and tangled to separate neatly. There is also something quietly significant in the Minotaur's diet, if one can call it that. The repeated sending of Athenian youths and maidens into the labyrinth has often been interpreted as a human sacrifice motif, though the exact historical basis remains uncertain. Some scholars see in it a memory of tribute, subjugation, or intercity dominance, transformed over time into mythic horror. Others suggest that the story preserves traces of older ritual exchanges, perhaps involving initiation, symbolic death, or the passage from one social state into another. Whatever its origin, the image is chilling in its stillness. The victims do not arrive as warriors but as offerings, and that changes the atmosphere of the tale entirely. The Minotaur is not chasing prey in an open field. He is waiting in a constructed dark, in a place where movement becomes ceremonial and doom feels scheduled. The labyrinth, in this sense, behaves almost like a temple turned inward on itself. Its corridors hold fear the way a sanctuary might hold incense, and the creature at the center is both priest and devourer, both recipient and endpoint of the ritual. The ancient world often blurred sacrifice and social order, and the Minotaur myth seems to preserve that blurred edge, where the price of power is paid in living flesh. The hero who eventually enters the maze, Theseus, is often remembered as the conqueror of the Minotaur, but the emotional shape of the story is subtler than a simple triumph. His success depends not only on strength, but on guidance, memory, and a thread. That little detail has lasted through centuries because it beautifully captures the problem of leaving a place designed to erase direction. Ariadne's thread is one of the most elegant images in all myth, a thin line of continuity against overwhelming complexity. It suggests that escape from the labyrinth does not come by force alone, but by keeping a connection to the world outside. In sleep and in waking life alike, there is something deeply reassuring about that idea. Even the most confusing spaces can be crossed if one can keep hold of a single reliable path, yet the thread also gives the victory a delicate quality. Theseus does not simply master the maze through heroism, he borrows a form of intelligence that is patient, domestic, and subtle. It is easy to imagine the ancient listener feeling both admiration and relief at this. The monster is dreadful, yes, but what defeats him is not another monster, not a storm of violence, but a humble human strategy. That makes the story feel less brutal and more balanced, as though order has finally been stitched back into place. The Minotaur's defeat, however, does not end the mythic resonance of the labyrinth. In many later interpretations, the creature becomes an image of what humans create and then must confront. The maze is built by Daedalus, the master craftsman, and this makes the whole narrative feel unexpectedly modern. It is as if ingenuity itself has produced the prison that ingenuity must later solve. Ancient storytellers were already aware that skill can become entanglement, that the finest design can generate the hardest problem. Daedalus is often praised as one of the great inventors of myth, a figure whose genius can construct wings, statues, traps, and impossible enclosures. His role in the Minotaur story gives the tale a quietly reflective quality. It is not only about a beast in a maze, but about the human capacity to make structures larger than our understanding. The labyrinth becomes a symbol of technical brilliance without moral steadiness, a work of order that somehow leads to greater disorder. That thought would have resonated in a world where architecture, kingship, and ritual were inseparable from prestige. It still resonates now. There is a peculiar chill in the idea that the very thing meant to contain the problem is also the thing that makes it so hard to recognize. There are also long traditions of trying to connect the Minotaur with real Bronze Age Crete, and although these theories cannot be proved with certainty, they continue to attract attention. The bull was a prominent image in Minoan art, appearing in frescoes, seals, and ceremonial scenes. Some of these images show athletic leaps over bulls, a practice that may have been ritual, performative, or symbolic, though the precise meaning remains debated. Because of this, the Minotaur has often been read not merely as fantasy, but as a later Greek reimagining of a culture they found ancient, impressive, and perhaps unsettling. The Palace of Knossos, rediscovered in modern times, intensified that connection for many viewers, especially because its complex layout seemed to embody the very idea of a labyrinth. Yet caution is always necessary here. Myth does not preserve history like a museum label. It transforms, condenses, and rearranges. Even if some distant memory of palace life or bull ritual lies behind the story, the Minotaur we know is the product of poetic imagination. That is part of his charm. He is both historical echo and dream figure, a creature whose possible roots in the past only make his unreal body feel more ancient, not less. The sense of depth matters more than certainty. What is especially striking when reading the myth carefully is how little direct speech the Minotaur is given. He is usually observed from the outside, described by others, feared by those who approach him, and slain without a conversation. This silence has made later artists and writers curious because it invites projection. Is he purely bestial, or is there some hidden suffering in the creature who lives at the center of the maze? Ancient sources do not linger there, but modern imagination often does. That gap is meaningful. The Minotaur's silence is not just a narrative omission, it is part of the atmosphere of the myth. A speaking monster might become a debater, a philosopher, or a comic figure. A silent one remains vast, unreadable, and dreamlike. He stands for everything in human experience that cannot be easily explained in words. In that sense, the Minotaur belongs to the same deep symbolic family as other creatures who embody inner conflict. He is a body made of contradiction, and the lack of speech keeps that contradiction unresolved. It is almost as though the story asks us to look at him and recognize that some forms of suffering or disorder are too primitive, too entangled, or too ancient for language to fully cross. And yet the Minotaur is not always treated with simple terror in later literature and art. Over time, he has become strangely tragic, even tender in certain retellings. Some modern interpretations imagine him as lonely, misunderstood, or captive within a structure not of his own making. That shift says a great deal about changing attitudes toward monsters. Where older traditions might use the Minotaur to mark corruption and punishment, later storytellers sometimes use him to explore alienation. After all, the labyrinth does not only hold a beast, it isolates a being. The creature's life is defined by enclosure, repetition, and absence. No open landscape, no family, no ordinary place in the world. Seen this way, the Minotaur becomes less a villain than a symbol of exile. This interpretation does not erase the violence of the original myth, but it does widen its emotional range. The monster can be frightening and pitiable at once. That combination is part of what keeps the story alive. Human beings seem to return to the Minotaur whenever they want to talk about the parts of life that are driven underground, hidden away, or made monstrous by the very systems meant to contain them. He is a mythic reminder that confinement itself can create the shape of fear. In the end, perhaps the Minotaur endures because he gathers so many ancient concerns into one form. He holds together kingship and shame, ritual and punishment, architecture and confusion, animal strength and human vulnerability. Few mythical beings are so densely layered. Even his body feels like a question that has been carved into symbol. The Greeks did not need to agree on every detail for the figure to remain powerful, because the uncertainty is part of the experience. A story with hard edges would close cleanly, but the Minotaur story keeps unfolding softly and irregularly in the imagination. One person sees a monster, another sees a royal secret, another sees a relic of old bull worship, another sees a lonely captive in a maze of his own making. These meanings do not cancel one another. They accumulate like faint footprints turning around a corridor. That is why the myth still feels alive after so many centuries. It does not sit still. It moves quietly through history, changing shape while keeping its central ache. And somewhere at the heart of all those interpretations remains the same strange, half-human figure, waiting in the dim center of the labyrinth, as if the oldest stories are still listening to the echo of his footsteps. In many tellings, the Minotaur is not simply a monster lurking in a labyrinth, but the lingering result of a broken chain of human decisions. Ancient audiences would have understood that idea almost immediately. The creature is born, after all, from a mixture of divine punishment, royal pride, and the slow accumulation of consequences. When people in the Greek world spoke of monstrous beings, they often were not only describing bodies with strange shapes, but also explaining a disorder in the moral world. The Minotaur could be read as the visible shape of an invisible shame, a creature whose existence kept the memory of a palace scandal alive. That may be one reason the story remained so powerful. It does not begin in the dark corridors of the labyrinth. It begins in the sunlit world of kings, temples, vows, and excuses. The darkness comes later, almost naturally, as if the narrative itself were descending into a deeper chamber. What makes the Minotaur especially unsettling is that it is both deeply animal and strangely human. The head is that of a bull, and the body is usually imagined as human, though ancient artists did not always agree on the exact form. Some depictions emphasize brute strength, others a more ambiguous hybridity, as if the creature were suspended between categories. That uncertainty matters. In myth, boundaries are often where the tension lives. The Minotaur stands at the edge of human identity, suggesting not a clean division between civilized and wild, but a fragile line that can be crossed or blurred. Greek thinkers and storytellers were fascinated by this threshold. A creature with a bull's head could symbolize appetite, force, fertility, and untamed power, while the human body below it kept the creature uncomfortably close to us. The result is not only fear, but recognition. The monster resembles something we are afraid might already be present in the human soul. A quieter detail in the background of the Minotaur myth is the bull itself, which held enormous symbolic weight in the ancient Mediterranean world. Bulls were associated with strength, virility, sacrifice, and royal authority. On Crete especially, bulls appear again and again in art and legend, and the island's later mythic identity became tied to that presence. Frescoes from Minoan sites show dynamic scenes involving bulls, leaping figures, and ceremonial activity, though scholars debate how directly these images connect to the later Greek stories. It is tempting, and perhaps too simple, to imagine a straight line from archaeological remains to myth. Still, there is clearly something in the ancient Cretan imagination that honored, feared, and dramatized the bull. The Minotaur in this light may preserve a distorted memory of a bull-centered culture, transformed through later Greek storytelling into a single trapped being in a hidden palace of stone. The labyrinth, where the Minotaur is kept, is sometimes treated as if it were just a large maze, but the idea carries a deeper feeling than simple complexity. A maze can be solved. A labyrinth feels more like an environment designed to disorient the body and slow the mind. Ancient listeners would not necessarily have pictured neatly measured hedge corridors, as in later European gardens. Instead, the labyrinth may have suggested a place of intricate architectural confusion, a space in which turns repeat, and the traveler loses confidence in direction. Some scholars have wondered whether the story remembered the layout of the palace at Knossos, with its many rooms, passages, and level changes. Others think the labyrinth is mostly symbolic, a mental architecture built to hold the Minotaur at the center of all things difficult to reach. Either way, the atmosphere is important. The labyrinth is not merely a prison. It is a story about being unable to find one's way back to the world that feels known and safe. There is also a strong sense in the myth that the Minotaur is hidden not only from the outside world, but from the ordinary life of the court that contains it. The palace of King Minos is often imagined as grand, bright, and ordered, while beneath or within it lies something shameful and unmanageable. That contrast gives the myth much of its emotional power. Civilized spaces are shown to depend on concealment. Splendor can coexist with dread, and royal authority may be built upon a secret that cannot be openly acknowledged. The Minotaur then becomes a kind of domestic secret made flesh. It is the thing the palace cannot admit, yet cannot entirely remove. The legend asks us to imagine the sound of feet on polished stone above, while somewhere below, in a chamber of dim torches and echoing walls, a heavy breath continues in the dark. The story lingers there, in the distance between public order and private consequence. The tribute of young men and women sent to Crete from Athens is one of the most haunting elements of the myth, precisely because it places the Minotaur within a larger political imagination. The story is not only about a single beast, but about domination, humiliation, and repeated loss. Athens, in the legend, is made to send its youth as payment, a rhythm of grief that occurs before the hero arrives to interrupt it. This detail may reflect later Greek reflections on power and subjugation, possibly even memories of a time when Crete seemed politically or culturally formidable. The actual historical truth is difficult to recover, and scholars are careful not to overstate any direct correspondence. Yet the myth clearly transforms ancient anxieties into a simple pattern. One city's flourishing is purchased by another's sorrow. The Minotaur becomes the center of that arrangement, the final destination of a tribute that feels both sacred and cruel, as if human vulnerability were being fed into a system too large to challenge. In some versions of the myth, Theseus enters the labyrinth with help, and that help is inseparable from the story's mood. Ariadne's thread is one of the most delicate and memorable details in all of Greek myth. It is small, practical, and almost quiet compared with the drama around it. A ball of thread, unwound carefully, becomes the difference between rescue and fatal confusion. The presence of the thread reminds us that ancient stories often valued intelligence as much as bravery. The Minotaur is not defeated by force alone, but by orientation, memory, and the ability to return. That return is crucial. The journey into the labyrinth is only half the challenge. To leave it again is a different kind of victory, one that suggests the deepest danger is not the monster itself, but the loss of one's path through a world of turns. In that sense, Ariadne's thread is almost a meditation on consciousness itself, a slender line of continuity preserving identity through darkness. Ancient artists loved the Minotaur because it offered such a striking visual form. Vase painters, sculptors, and later Roman artists returned to the encounter between Theseus and the beast with remarkable persistence. The composition often freezes the instant before or during struggle, Theseus gripping, twisting, or striking, while the Minotaur turns with an expression that may seem fierce, startled, or almost sorrowful depending on the style. These images are not only illustrations of a story, they are also meditations on bodily power, control, and the tension between heroism and violence. In some works, the human and animal aspects of the Minotaur are emphasized equally, making the creature appear less like a simple villain and more like a tragic figure caught in an unavoidable role. Such representations remind us that ancient mythology was not fixed in a single moral key. Artists could make the Minotaur terrifying, pitiable, or majestic, sometimes all at once, as if the creature contained too many meanings for any one image to settle. The story's endurance in later centuries owes something to the fact that the Minotaur never stayed in a single cultural form. In the Roman world, the myth continued, but it could be adapted to new tastes for spectacle and moral allegory. In medieval and Renaissance retellings, the labyrinth might become a symbol of sin, confusion, or the soul's difficult journey. In modern literature and art, the Minotaur often changes again, becoming a figure of exile, loneliness, or trapped identity. This flexibility is part of what keeps the myth alive. The creature can be made to embody many forms of confinement: physical imprisonment, social otherness, inherited guilt, inner appetite, or the loneliness of being misunderstood. Each age seems to have found in the Minotaur a different version of itself. That does not weaken the myth, it deepens it. A story that can hold so many interpretations may be doing a quieter work, offering people a shape for feelings that are otherwise difficult to name. There is, too, a strange tenderness in some modern retellings of the Minotaur that is worth noting. While the ancient Greek sources usually frame the creature as a threat to be destroyed, later imagination sometimes pauses to wonder what it means to live as the Minotaur. A being enclosed from birth, denied ordinary human community, and fed only through violence is almost bound to appear tragic when viewed from inside the labyrinth rather than from the hero's path. This shift in perspective does not erase the fear of the original myth. Instead, it reveals another layer beneath it, the possibility that monsters are often made, not born, through systems that isolate them. Whether or not one accepts that reading, the emotional atmosphere of the myth becomes more complex. The Minotaur is still dangerous, still enormous, still terrible in its hunger, but the story can also suggest a life shaped entirely by confinement. That is a quietly sorrowful idea, and perhaps one reason the monster has never lost its power to move readers. Even the name Minotaur carries a formal and almost ceremonial quality, as if it were less a personal name than a title. It means in effect the bull of Minos, tying the creature directly to the king and his house. That naming is important because it prevents the monster from becoming fully separate from the human world that produced it. The beast is not an outsider in the simplest sense. It is linked to the royal line, to a kingdom, to a scandal, to a chain of circumstances that cannot be detached from the people around it. In myth, names often act like little histories. They preserve the memory of origin, ownership, and blame. To say Minotaur is to remember that the creature belongs to a story of kings and consequences, not merely a story of claws and teeth. In this way, the name itself becomes a compact of mythic meaning, quiet but heavy, like a door closing softly somewhere deep in the palace. And finally, one of the most enduring qualities of the Minotaur is the silence at its center. So much of the legend is told from the perspective of others: kings, queens, heroes, victims, and storytellers. The creature itself rarely speaks. That silence has encouraged countless interpretations, but it also contributes to the eerie calm of the myth. A silent monster in a silent labyrinth becomes less a conversational character than a presence, something felt through movement, breath, and the imagined echo of footsteps on stone. Sleepy listeners may find that strangely soothing because the myth's terror is held at a distance by its own structure. The Minotaur waits, the labyrinth waits, the thread is prepared, the hero enters, and the story moves forward with the patient certainty of ancient ritual. Beneath all the noise of battle and legend, there remains a quiet chamber of waiting, where the creature's stillness becomes part of the myth's lasting hush. In many later retellings, the Minotaur becomes less a monster with a single body and more a kind of inherited shadow, something that moves through generations of the House of Minos like a family curse made visible. Ancient storytellers often return to this idea of bloodline, punishment, and consequence, as if the creature were not only locked in the labyrinth, but also locked inside the history of the royal family itself. That makes the myth feel quieter in a strange way, because it is not only about teeth and violence. It is also about the slow pressure of secrets, the way a wrongdoing can echo far beyond the moment it happens. In that sense, the Minotaur belongs to a long Greek fascination with inherited guilt, where the past does not stay past, and old acts continue to shape the present like a lingering draft in an enclosed stone corridor. The connection between the Minotaur and bull symbolism also reaches far beyond the best-known story. In the ancient Aegean world, bulls were not just animals of strength. They were tied to ritual, power, fertility, and status, and their image appears again and again in frescoes, pottery, seals, and mythic language. Some scholars have suggested that the Minotaur may preserve a distorted memory of an older bull-centered cult or ceremonial practice from Crete, though that idea can never be proven with certainty. What is clear is that the bull was an important figure in Minoan and later Greek imagination, and the Minotaur gathers many of those meanings into one unsettling form. He is at once sacred and threatening, regal and trapped, a creature whose very shape seems to hold the tension between reverence and fear. Even now, the myth feels stronger because it rests on something ancient and recognizable, something that once had to be seen with real attention in a living culture. As the story moved through centuries, artists began to imagine the Minotaur in very different ways, and those differences tell us almost as much as the myth itself. On painted pottery from antiquity, he is often shown as a violent opponent of Theseus, a being caught in the briefest and most dramatic instant of confrontation. In later sculpture and painting, however, he sometimes appears more isolated, more contemplative, even sorrowful, as though the artist has stepped back from the battle and looked into the creature's loneliness. This shift is important because it shows how mythology can soften and deepen over time. A figure once used to embody terror can become a symbol of confinement, estrangement, or misunderstood nature. The Minotaur's body, half man and half bull, gives artists a rare opportunity to explore the boundary between humanity and animality, and that boundary has never been a simple line. It is often a hazy place, full of questions, and the myth gives those questions a shape that can be remembered. The labyrinth itself became almost inseparable from the Minotaur, even though the two are not quite the same thing. In older storytelling, the creature and the maze seem to grow together, each making the other more haunting. The Minotaur needs the labyrinth to remain hidden, and the labyrinth needs the Minotaur to justify its existence. Over time, the maze came to represent more than architecture. It became a mental landscape, a way of thinking about confusion, entrapment, and the difficulty of finding a clear path through danger. That is probably one reason the image lasted so long. People can easily understand a winding passage, a place where every turn looks uncertain and the way back is not immediately visible. When paired with the silent threat of the Minotaur, the labyrinth becomes a kind of dream structure, familiar and unsettling at once, like wandering through a half-remembered building at night and knowing there is something waiting farther in. There is also a surprisingly human side to the Minotaur's story, in the way he is sometimes framed as a victim of circumstance rather than a deliberate villain. This does not excuse the terror attached to the creature, but it does complicate the myth in a thoughtful way. The Minotaur did not choose his birth, his form, or his confinement. He enters the world already marked by the decisions of others, and that has made him a powerful figure for later writers interested in sympathy, responsibility, and the cost of divine or royal pride. In some modern readings, the Minotaur becomes a symbol of the being who is treated as monstrous because of what others have done first. That is a much quieter and more melancholy interpretation than the original tale of heroism and death. It asks the listener to sit with discomfort a little longer, to see the edges of the story not as clean moral lines, but as a complicated chain of causes, accidents, and inherited conditions. The rhythm of the Minotaur myth also reflects the ancient Greek habit of turning place into memory. Crete, Knossos, Athens, and the labyrinth are not just settings. They are anchors that make the legend feel grounded, almost historical, even when the details clearly belong to imagination. Ancient audiences were very attuned to the power of named locations, because a story tied to a real island or city could seem both more credible and more vivid. Crete in particular carried a kind of prestige and mystery, since it was associated with an older and powerful civilization whose ruins would have inspired later wonder. Whether or not the myth preserves faint traces of real events, the landscape matters deeply. The sea crossing, the palace, the hidden chambers, the uneasy distance between island and mainland all create a mood of separation. The Minotaur is not simply in a cave somewhere. He is at the center of a world that has been carefully arranged around him, and that arrangement feels as deliberate as it does tragic. One of the most quietly fascinating things about the Minotaur is how often scholars and writers have been drawn to the question of his name. Minotaur itself is a compound, usually understood as meaning the bull of Minos, and that naming already places the creature in a web of identity and ownership. The name does not describe him as a unique individual so much as a being attached to a king, a dynasty, and a political order. In mythology, names often do this work very efficiently. They can reveal origin, status, ancestry, or obligation in just a few sounds. Here, the name reminds us that the Minotaur is never fully separate from the human world. He is marked by it, named by it, and claimed by it. Even his monstrousness is framed in relation to human authority, which makes the story feel less like a simple tale of wild otherness and more like a meditation on how power defines the beings it creates or contains. The Minotaur's endurance in modern culture may also come from the fact that he is visually unforgettable, but difficult to settle. His face can be shown in a dozen different ways and still remain instantly recognizable. Some portrayals emphasize brute force, broad horns, and a heavy body that seems to press against the frame. Others keep the bull features but make the human side more visible, giving him eyes that appear almost thoughtful or mournful. This flexibility has made him a favorite subject in literature, film, and visual art, where each era projects its own anxieties onto the creature. In one century, he may stand for violence and confinement. In another, he may represent alienation, masculinity, appetite, or the fear of what lies beneath civilization's surface. The myth stays alive partly because it refuses to stay still. Like a figure seen through moving shadows, it keeps changing shape as the viewer changes, and that means the Minotaur can continue to speak in very different tones without ever losing his essential strangeness. Another detail that often draws attention is the role of ritual in the broader mythic world around the Minotaur. The ancient stories of Crete are filled with signs that suggest ceremonial life was deeply important, from sacred spaces to symbolic acts involving animals, movement, and transformation. Because the surviving evidence is fragmentary, historians have to be careful, and certainty is not always possible. Still, it is reasonable to say that the Minotaur legend may have emerged from a culture where the bull had ceremonial force, and where mythic storytelling absorbed that force into a dramatic narrative. The result is a creature that feels like more than fiction, because he seems to arise from the meeting point of ritual memory and imaginative storytelling. Even the horror around him may reflect a distant sacred seriousness, turned into legend over time. In that way, the Minotaur is not merely a monster invented from nothing. He may be the echo of an older symbolic world, softened and darkened by centuries of retelling until only the powerful image remained. Finally, there is something almost meditative in the way the Minotaur persists as a symbol of hidden interior space. The labyrinth, after all, is not only a prison in the story. It is also a place where the inside of things becomes important. Corridors lead inward, paths loop back, and the center remains obscured until the moment of discovery. This has made the Minotaur a lasting image for the concealed parts of human life, the places people avoid because they are difficult to name or understand. Ancient audiences may not have described it in psychological terms, but the myth already contains that feeling. There is a monster in the middle of the maze, and the maze seems to resemble the mind, or the heart, or any structure that becomes more complex the longer one looks at it. The power of the Minotaur is that he stands guard over what is buried. He is frightening, yes, but he is also a boundary marker, a reminder that some truths are reached only by moving carefully through darkness, one quiet turn at a time. By the time the Minotaur appears in later retellings, he is no longer just a creature of a single dramatic story, but a kind of symbol that keeps accumulating meaning. Ancient audiences could see him as punishment, as tragedy, as the result of broken order, or as a reminder that even royal power can produce something wild and uncontrollable. That shifting role is one reason the Minotaur endures so strongly in the imagination. He is not fixed in one simple moral shape. Instead, he seems to stand at the border between story and symbol, between animal force and human guilt. In some versions, he is almost a cautionary sign made flesh, a living consequence of pride and poor judgment. In others, he is simply a lonely being trapped inside a system he never chose. That ambiguity gives the tale its quiet depth. It can be read in several directions at once, and none of them completely cancels the others. Even in antiquity, the Minotaur could belong to religion, to politics, to poetry, and to the strange emotional space where people try to understand what they fear. Over time, that same flexibility allowed artists and writers to keep returning to him, each generation reshaping the monster to fit new anxieties, new tastes, and new ways of thinking about the human body, the city, and the wilderness hidden at the center of civilization. In a more literal sense, the Minotaur's home in the labyrinth has often been treated as one of the most famous prisons in myth, but the idea of the labyrinth itself is older and richer than the story alone. A labyrinth is not merely a maze built to confuse. In many ancient and later traditions, it is also a pattern of ordeal, a path that leads inward and then back again, a design that can resemble a journey through difficulty toward understanding. The labyrinth of Crete may have been imagined as a place so complex that escape was nearly impossible, but the deeper meaning is that it represents a world where orientation fails. One cannot move through it with ordinary confidence. The walls turn thinking into uncertainty, the footsteps echo, even the air seems to hold its breath. This is part of why the Minotaur feels so haunting in the story. He does not simply live in a building, he lives in disorientation itself. Whether the ancient audience pictured a vast palace complex, a symbolic underground prison, or a storybook structure of impossible twists, the effect is similar. The creature becomes inseparable from a space designed for confusion, and confusion becomes one of the tale's central moods. In that way, the labyrinth is as important as the monster, perhaps even more so, because it gives the myth its closed, dreamlike atmosphere. There is also a quiet historical fascination in the way the Minotaur story connects with the broader ancient Greek habit of turning political memory into myth. Crete was remembered as an island of wealth, maritime power, and old kingship. Athens, meanwhile, often appears in the story as the city that resists humiliation and eventually recovers its dignity. The tale of tribute, sacrifice, and escape can therefore be read not only as a monster story, but as a story about power between cities. Ancient myths frequently preserved social tensions in this kind of symbolic form, allowing collective memory to be expressed through gods and beasts, rather than through plain historical record. The Minotaur may preserve echoes of older relationships between mainland Greeks and Crete, or perhaps even memory fragments from earlier eras of Aegean civilization that later storytellers transformed into legend. Scholars have long wondered how much of the myth reflects distant cultural contact, palace life, ritual spectacle, or simple narrative invention. The truth may be partly all of these things. What matters is that the Minotaur gives shape to a historical feeling, the fear of being dominated, the hope of release, and the desire to imagine that courage can eventually untie what power has bound. That is a human pattern much older than anyone telling of the tale. Another reason the Minotaur remains so compelling is that he is strangely divided between nature and culture. He is part bull, part man, and his body itself seems to ask a question about where human identity begins and ends. Bulls in the ancient Mediterranean carried immense symbolic force. They suggested strength, fertility, danger, sacrifice, and at times sacred majesty. Human beings, by contrast, were associated with speech, reason, social order, and law. The Minotaur combines these domains in a way that feels both impossible and revealing. He is not simply an animal, because he has a human mind in many later depictions. Yet he is not simply human, because his shape is ruled by instinctive force. This in-between state makes him one of mythology's most enduring images of divided nature. He belongs to the category of the hybrid, and hybrids often appear in myths when cultures want to think about boundaries. What happens when those boundaries fail? What if one being carries two incompatible worlds inside it? The Minotaur answers not with language but with presence. He stands in the dark, breathing, listening, never fully at home in either of the two forms that make him. That quiet tension gives the story much of its sadness, because the monster's body seems to embody a conflict before any action begins. Ancient art also shows that the Minotaur was not always presented only as a horror. In some images, especially later ones, he can appear almost vulnerable, even sad, as if the artists were interested not only in the drama of combat, but in the emotional loneliness of the creature itself. Greek vase painting and later sculpture, mosaics and reliefs often focused on the moment when Theseus confronts the Minotaur, freezing the scene at the instant before violence resolves the story. This visual tradition allowed viewers to contemplate the monster as more than a defeated enemy. The body of the Minotaur could be rendered with great care, emphasizing the curve of the bull's head, the muscular strength of the torso, or the strained movement of the struggle. Sometimes Ariadne appears nearby in the background of the cultural memory, sometimes not. But the creature remains central because he gives artists a form that is both familiar and strange. The ancient eye, accustomed to bulls in ritual and labor, would recognize the animal element immediately. The human element, however, unsettles recognition and pulls the image into the realm of myth. It is worth remembering that ancient art was not always about neat moral lessons. Often it was about presence, energy, and the suspended moment when a story becomes visible. The Minotaur offered exactly that kind of charged stillness. In literary tradition, the Minotaur also becomes a useful way to explore the nature of confinement. A creature locked away, fed by tribute, and cut off from ordinary life raises questions not only about punishment but about justice. Was the Minotaur born guilty or made guilty by the conditions surrounding him? Different retellings lean differently on this point. Some describe him as savage and dangerous from the beginning, making his imprisonment seem necessary. Others create a more tragic atmosphere, in which the creature is less a moral agent than a consequence of curse and secrecy. In that reading, the real violence may not be the Minotaur's existence, but the system built around it. The labyrinth becomes a kind of hidden infrastructure of fear, maintained so that the rest of the world can keep living without confronting the origin of the problem. This is a powerful pattern in storytelling because it mirrors the way societies sometimes excel what they do not want to understand. The Minotaur can thus be read as the thing a community locks away when it cannot face its own disorder. That interpretation gives the myth an almost psychological dimension, as though the labyrinth were not only under Crete, but within the mind itself, where troubling truths are stored and avoided until a hero enters to meet them. The story's sleepier, quieter side may be found in the way the Minotaur is often imagined in chambers below the bright world. There is almost no sunlight there, only stone, shadow, and the sounds of a distant palace above. Such settings naturally invite a slower mood. One can imagine the damp air of the labyrinth, the smell of earth and old masonry, the hush broken by movement in hidden corridors. This atmosphere is important because myths are often carried as much by sensory memory as by plot. The Minotaur's world is not a place of open sky and sweeping travel. It is enclosed, inward, and dim. In that sense, the story feels less like a battlefield and more like a descent into deep architecture. The hero's footsteps, the thread unspooling, the careful turning of corners, all suggest deliberate movement through uncertainty. Even the monster's presence is filtered through distance and enclosure. He is heard before he is fully seen. This slow reveal is part of the tale's power. It makes the Minotaur feel not only dangerous but anticipatory, as though the whole underground space is waiting for a conclusion that has already been set in motion. For a modern listener, this can create a kind of calm suspense, the sort that settles around a myth told at night, where danger exists but is held inside the rhythm of the narrative. Over centuries, writers have returned to the Minotaur precisely because he can be reimagined in so many registers. In some modern works, he becomes a creature of raw appetite. In others, he is transformed into a lonely captive, a misunderstood figure, or even a metaphor for artistic isolation. Modern psychological and literary readings often shift emphasis away from heroic conquest and toward identity, shame, and exile. The Minotaur becomes an emblem of the self that cannot be easily integrated. He is the part of existence that remains hard to name. This is a far cry from simple monster slaying, yet it remains faithful to the old myth's emotional core. Ancient stories are often more adaptable than they first appear, because their symbols are built with enough openness to accommodate new concerns. The Minotaur is one of those symbols. He can inhabit children's books, scholarly essays, surreal paintings, or meditative reinterpretations, and each version can still feel connected to the original. That continuing flexibility helps explain why the Minotaur has not faded into obscurity. He persists because he is less a single figure than a vessel for recurring human questions. What happens when power becomes secretive, when identity is divided, when fear is stored underground, and when the boundaries between human and animal, civilized and wild, begin to blur? The role of Theseus in the myth also changes the way the Minotaur is remembered. It is tempting to think of the hero as the center and the monster as the obstacle, but the story's emotional force depends on their relationship. Theseus is not only the one who kills, he is also the one who enters where others cannot, who follows a path that ordinary courage would find impossible. The thread given by Ariadne becomes a small but profound symbol of connection, memory, and return. Against that careful human tactic stands the Minotaur, who waits in the depth of the maze as if he has been placed there by a world that has already decided his fate. This makes their meeting feel almost ritualistic. One arrives from the sunlit world with purpose and guidance. The other exists in the hidden center, representing the problem that must be faced. Yet the story does not erase the creature's dignity. In some versions, the Minotaur fights fiercely, embodying strength even in defeat. That is part of why the myth remains memorable. It is not a clean victory over a simple beast. It is a confrontation with a being whose existence has been made monstrous by a chain of events larger than himself. The thread, the path, the darkness, and the final encounter all give the tale a ceremonial quality, as though the act of facing the Minotaur is also the act of recovering a lost order. Finally, there is a deep and lasting reason the Minotaur continues to stir the imagination. He sits at the threshold of the human self. Ancient myths often place such creatures at points of transformation, where the ordinary world breaks and another kind of truth becomes visible. The Minotaur is one of the most famous of these threshold figures because he is impossible to classify neatly. He is a monster, but also a victim of mythic circumstance. He is a danger, but also a product of royal secrecy. He is animal, but also human. He is hidden away, yet remembered for thousands of years. That combination creates a strange calm in the mind of the listener because the myth does not demand a single interpretation. It simply stays present, like a dim shape at the end of a corridor. The old stories around him have survived not only because they are dramatic, but because they are spacious enough for wonder, doubt, and sympathy. In the quiet after the tale is told, the Minotaur remains in that underground place, breathing in the dark, while above him the world continues its long movement of kings, cities, ships, and memory. And so the old story can rest for the night, still full of stone corridors, distant sea air, and the quiet shape of a creature that has remained in memory for so long. Let the image of the Minotaur fade gently now, not as a fright, but as one of the ancient world's most enduring symbols of secrecy, power, and consequence. Sleep well, and keep the story nearby for another evening.